Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, December 16th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the storylines around all of the teams as they head into the playoff, give one for each team that I think is probably the biggest one for each of these teams. Then we'll get to a little bit of Heisman roundup. Travis Hunter wins the closest contest since 2009. Want to break it down and why some of the reaction is just downright ridiculous, but we'll get into that here in a second. Then we'll get to a little bit of a weekend roundup. We'll talk about the Navy-Army game, the couple of bowl games that happened, as well as the FCS quarterfinals. We have a little bit of a lull here. Might as well give some love to the FCS teams down there. Then we'll get to the transfer portal. A ton of commitments that happened this past weekend, so we'll roll through that pretty quickly if I had to imagine. A lot of different things to get to there. And then we'll do a little bit of a weekend roundup. All the headlines that happened this past weekend, a couple of little updates from the Bill Belichick UNC start, and then we'll talk about Marshall opting out of the bowl game and why that is obviously a terrible thing, and we'll talk about the schedule a little bit in more detail tomorrow most likely. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $sign, add any question, comment you'd like. I'll read your name, read your question, we can have fun back and forth here. We're getting very close to those first round games, so any questions you have about those, I'm more than happy to answer them here. But let's go ahead and jump into this, and we'll talk about the storylines as we head into the CFP. We'll get into the biggest storyline, at least from my perspective, for every team as they head into this thing, and there's quite a few of them for a lot of these teams, so some of them are a little bit are kind of sub storylines. You know, it's a little bit too battling for that top billing, but we'll start with that number one team in the country, and it's all about getting that first title. Oregon's still one of the teams that has not had a national title, probably the best program that has not had a national title, right up there with Wisconsin and West Virginia and a couple others that have had a lot of really successful seasons, have never gotten that ultimate prize. And that's what Dan Lanning, that's what Oregon is looking for this year. If they're going to do it, they got to go a perfect 16-0. They got to be the very first team to go 16-0 in a college football season and win a national title in the process. And it would be an incredible thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. We've watched this team all year. They are as laser focused as I've seen in a really long time for a team that is this new to this world in reality. You know, this new to the upper echelon of college football. A lot of these players, the head coach obviously is new to this. Their ability to keep their cool throughout all of these big time moments throughout the year has been absolutely incredible, and it really does lend itself to them possibly doing that in a further degree throughout this playoff. So a lot of different things that are on the table for this team, a lot of different storylines as you head into this thing, but the reality is when you're an Oregon fan right now, you're thinking about that first national title. You're thinking about being the team on the top of the mountaintop and totally changing the way that you go about your business going forward, and a lot of people are on college football starting to be a little bit scared of that team up there in Eugene after this year if they can finish this thing off. For Georgia, there's a lot of different things at stake, but Gunnar Stockton stepping in is going to be the biggest storyline heading in. Now, you could very well argue possible third title in 4 years. That might be the biggest storyline heading in, but when you have an injury like Carson Beck and when he goes down and you got to win a title Cardale Jones style, that's exactly what the storyline's going to be. It's going to be whoever the Cardale Jones is in this scenario. This time it's Gunnar Stockton. He has all of the ability in the world. We saw him in different flashes during that SEC championship. The ability is really incredible. He has a ton of ability running the football. Obviously has a little bit more arm strength than Carson Beck. I wouldn't necessarily say he has more arm talent, but absolutely has a little bit more whip on that ball, has a little bit more strength behind that arm. He has all the ability in the world. That's not going to be an issue for this. The question is, how comfortable is he in this system? How comfortable is he stepping out on that field in the very first time? I believe they're down in Miami for the Orange Bowl. Is he going to feel confident? Is he going to feel calm? And can he execute at the level that they're going to need to against a possible defense like Notre Dame, which is very, very tough to deal with, especially for a young quarterback. So this is the far and away, the slam dunk one here, because Gunnar Stockton has a lot on his shoulders, and every Georgia fan is talking about him when they're talking about this playoff. Boise State we're all going to be watching that number 2. I think we all understand that at this point. We're going to be watching him possibly run to a record and possibly pass Barry Sanders if he gets to 132 rush yards in that game against Penn State or SMU. He will pass Barry Sanders for the most rushing yards in a season in college football history. Would be an incredible thing to watch, and if you think 132 is a little bit too lofty, he went for 133 against Oregon earlier this year, so he has the ability to do it. That's not even a question. He absolutely has history very much in reach. A lot of people questioning if they can make a run to the title, as am I, but the history is not necessarily out of reach if they don't make a little bit of run in this thing. Could be an incredible moment for Ashton Jeanty if you can get to that 132 mark, and then, just for fun, see if you can pull an upset and move on to the semifinals. Arizona State, it's just all about silencing the doubters and continuing to do that. They've done it all year. They were picked very, very last in the Big 12 as they were heading into this year, picked 16th in that conference. They are off on their way to the CFP, have won the conference in their very first year, and they're going to be waiting for either Clemson or Texas in that second round matchup. No one's going to pick them. Let's be honest. I think I've seen probably 100 different predictions for how this playoff is going to go. I don't think I've seen a ton with Arizona State in the semifinals. It's either Clemson or Texas, depending on who wins that game for you. They've gotten pretty used to that. They've gotten pretty used to people saying that they're not good enough, that they're not physical enough. They're more than happy to continue to silence doubters, and that's what they're going to try to do throughout this playoff. For Texas, it's the question that's been going around the entire week. We talked about it a ton last week. We'll probably talk about it a ton this week. I apologize, but it's definitely a huge storyline as we head into this thing because this is the overwhelming question. What is going to happen with that quarterback position? First of all, what is the split to start? How much is Quinn Ewers in the game? How much is Arch Manning in the game? Does Arch Manning come in a little bit more in the red zone area? And then on top of that, how quick is the pull on a Quinn Ewers if he does come out and struggle against that Clemson defense to start? Is it 1 quarter? Is it 1 half? Does he let him play out that game even if they're shaping up to lose? There's a lot of different questions around this, and definitely one where you're probably going to need to use Arch a little bit more. The question is, how comfortable is Steve Sarkisian of letting him rip the way that a lot of people think that you're going to need to in this playoff? And then if he doesn't come into the game as often as you would think he would, what does that look like for this offense, and how do they function without a possible Arch Manning package involved in this? For Penn State, it's the question that pops up every time around this time of year around James Franklin. Can he win the big one, quote unquote? Can he do the thing that he has really struggled to do? Hasn't beaten that top flight team from the Big 12 or from the Big 10 throughout the last couple of years, and frankly could continue into the CFP, because the question is, a lot of people have been saying this isn't a big game because it's only SMU. It's a college football playoff game. It is a big game. There's no question that it is a big game. So if he were to win it, I would absolutely give him some props. But the reality is, people that are saying it's not a big game, they're basically just saying he cannot lose. And I would tend to agree with them there. They lose, and the narrative is no longer, well, they can't beat Ohio State. They can't beat Michigan. They can't beat Oregon. It's going to be, they can't beat anyone that is on a big-time stage, that is on a big-time moment. They don't have the ability to step up to that moment. That is going to be a huge question for this team, and the narrative will get very, very loud around James Franklin, and definitely some people behind closed doors will be having some conversations. I'm not saying James Franklin's job is on the line this weekend, because I tend to believe it's not, but I'm just saying there will be a lot of interesting conversations being had if they cannot win this one, because they thought Ohio State and Michigan were their bugaboo. Maybe it's just every single big game that you run into. For Notre Dame, it's the thing that could totally change the way that we look at this playoff, which is that pass game showing up. If the pass game becomes what it has the capability of being in some respects, the talent at the wide receiver position is very solid. They do have Mitchell Evans. Riley Leonard's not the passer that you would love to have in this scenario, but absolutely is a guy that can get the ball where it needs to go. The reality is they need to be more explosive. They need to be more dangerous down the football field. They need to be a little bit more, make those safeties, make those linebackers think a little bit more about what they're going to do on the deep balls. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's very, very difficult, especially with how good that run game is and how inconsistent that pass game has been pretty much all year. It's got to take a step forward. There's no way you're going to be able to beat a Georgia or be able to beat a Texas or an Oregon or whoever in the national title if you don't have a pass game to fall back on. You're going to have to get a little bit of that going, whether that's Chris Mitchell or Jaden Greathouse or Faison, whoever that looks like, whoever that is. You're going to have to be able to get a couple of big-time plays down the football field in the pass game, or it's going to be a relatively benign offense. It's going to be one that still has the capability of scoring, probably not to the degree that you're going to need to. So that pass game is going to be huge, and definitely the thing that I'm watching this weekend against Indiana. For Ohio State, it's probably the biggest storyline of the entire weekend, and it is Ryan Day's future. If he loses this game, I fully expect him to be fired on Sunday. Obviously, something that is kind of contentious around Columbus and around a lot of different places. I think this is a fantastic head coach. I think it's very, very unlikely that Ohio State will be able to go out this cycle and go find a better coach, if I'm being totally honest. There are a couple of guys out there that I think they could go after and possibly get. The reality is a lot of those guys are in very, very good positions right now. If you want to try to go back to Urban, doesn't sound like that's going to work out too well for you. So a lot of the replacements have started to sign to extensions, including Marcus Freeman just a minute ago signed an extension with Notre Dame. You got a lot of questions, and it's going to be one of those things where if they lose this weekend, I fully expect him to be let go. I don't know what the steps are after that. So maybe you won't be let go. Maybe the future is not in the balance this weekend, but it really does feel like that if you're an Ohio State fan, and I assume that Ryan Day feels that as well. For Tennessee, does it feel like 1998 this time around? Because there was a lot of this talk around 2022 when Hendon Hooker and that offense was absolutely rolling. They had beaten Alabama. They had gotten over that hump. And they were looking at a possible playoff berth. They were looking at a possible national title. They were looking at so many different things that they possibly could do. And then Hendon Hooker went down, and pretty much everything fell off the tracks. A lot of things went wrong for them. Obviously, this last year with Joe Milton did not go the way that they wanted to. Now they have the quarterback, and they have a better defense, and they have a better run game, and they have probably better coaches just overall from experience standpoint. They're in a position where they got a chance. If they win that first game, if they move on to play Oregon, now the path that they have to go to get to a national title is an absolute nightmare, and then they might have to face one of the teams that took them down earlier in the year in Georgia to do it. But at the end of the day, there is a little bit about this team that was not there in 2022. There is a much higher floor for this team, and there is a much higher ability on defense. Maybe it does feel like 1998 this time around, and maybe it's not about the explosive offense. Maybe it's about the suffocating defense and the run game that they have. Indiana, you just got to change the narrative, and you've been doing it pretty much all year. This is not a team that many people respect, just plain and simple. There's not a team that is going to be picked to win that game on Saturday very often, or Friday, getting a little bit lost in the schedule, but it's not going to be a team that a lot of people pick to go remotely far in this tournament. It's their job to change the narrative. It's their job to change that, shock the world, move on to the next round, and then say you're playing with house money at that point. You're playing a Georgia team that, again, no one's going to pick you against. Just go to work. It's all about every single week. Everyone telling you that you can't do it, and then you go out there and do it. It's obviously kind of a grandiose, kind of abstract idea, but it is a very real one, and definitely one that they're feeling right now in Bloomington. SMU, prove the committee right. That's the goal of this Saturday and really of this entire tournament is you got to make sure that committee sits back and says, we made the right decision keeping SMU in over Alabama, because people will question that. Even if they lose by 3 points, people will question it. Those people would be wrong. But at the end of the day, there will be some talk about this. If they lose by 21, if they lose by 14 against Penn State, people will be sitting back and saying, could have been Alabama. You could have put Alabama in there, and it would have made so much more sense. People would have enjoyed it more. It would have been a better product on TV. SMU's job is to prove the committee right. Go up there, put up a really good fight against that Penn State team, and maybe, just maybe, get a win and move on to the next round. And then for Clemson, this is kind of the most grandiose one of the bunch, maybe beyond Ryan Day's future, but Clemson has a chance here where if they win, they are firmly on top of the sport. They are staying on top of the sport for quite some time. If they fall in this one, I think there's some questions around Clemson going forward. You have a Miami team that continues to build, that continues to improve. SMU crashed the party this year and is going to be a problem for years to come. And then you talk about a team like Syracuse, a team like Georgia Tech, a team like Duke that is playing really, really good football right now. Is there enough oxygen in the room for Clemson to stay on top the way that they want to if they were to lose in this in this game? Obviously, they're going into the portal this time around. That should help them a little bit to stay on top of the conference, but could this possibly be a little bit of a swan song from this Clemson program for a little bit of time to come if they were to fall in the first round? Because there's a lot of questions around that team, around that program, and around that roster going into 2025. And if they can get a win here, I think a lot of that is subsided. If they can't, then I think a lot of those questions continue to pop up, and Dabo Swinney has a lot of things they has to deal with during the offseason. So a lot of storylines heading into this thing. I think Ryan Day's future might take the cake of the biggest one as we head into this weekend in particular, but I think there's a lot of different ones that we'll talk about throughout this week. I believe I'm doing all my picks on Wednesday, but have debated splitting them up between Wednesday and Thursday. I'll figure it out. We'll do one of those days. Probably on Wednesday, we'll just do a full extravaganza, but a lot of different storylines as we head into this thing, and a lot of different fallouts that could possibly happen if things don't go right up there in Columbus or don't go right in a number of different places. So we'll break it down as it does, obviously, but when we let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the Heisman. We'll talk about a little bit of a roundup of the Heisman, how some of the reaction is absolutely ridiculous. I'll give you the top 10 voting. I'll give you the ones that I'm watching for next year. A lot of different things to talk about right after this, so stick with us.